I am joined now by Yaneev Forman, who is aboard a ship in the Arctic Circle currently. Yaneev, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me on after all the complexity and difficulty of setting this up.
Can you tell us, where are you right now as we're speaking?
We're traveling across the Davis Strait. We've just left Greenland, and we should be at sea for about a day and a half before we reach the Labrador coast.
And now I know you're traveling with a group called Students on Ice. Can you tell us a little bit about Students on Ice and what is their reason for taking you on this trip?
Students on Ice is the only organization in the world that takes students and brings them to the Arctic and Antarctic for the purpose of educating them about the challenges facing the Arctic, about the environmental issues facing the Arctic, the social issues facing the Arctic, the cultural issues facing the Arctic, and more than that, brings the students together with every type of scientist, artist, educator you can imagine, and provides a unique opportunity for the students to learn from those people in the Arctic while seeing firsthand evidence of climate change.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit just about what you've seen so far.
Absolutely. We have had a pretty incredible adventure because when you're navigating the fjords and seas in the far north, you never know quite what's going to happen, whether a certain entranceway or passage is going to be blocked by sea ice, whether there are going to be glaciers or whatever in your way. So our plans change day by day, minute by minute, depending on what's safe, what's feasible. But we have seen some pretty incredible things in South Greenland, especially. One of the most important things I think we saw was we were navigating a fjord, which was obviously water. I mean, we were on a ship. But on the charts that had been reviewed up on the bridge of the ship dated back to the 1960s, or some of the charts that they had up there dated back to the 1960s, where that fjord appeared as a frozen glacial area, not navigable by any ship. But because of climate change, we were able to float on what had formerly been ice, compacted into a glacial formation. So we were floating on evidence of climate change in a way that was sort of, you can't really conceive unless you see it yourself.
And was there any evidence left of the glacier that had blocked the fjord as recently as a couple of years ago when you entered the area?
I believe the glacier had been there. I don't think it was a couple of years ago. I think it was a decade earlier, but certainly it had been a victim of climate change. Yes, how it looked was we were down in the fjord, and on either side were cliffs and mountains, and way up in the top you could see ice caps. But previously, though, that ice had extended further down into the fjord, so you could see it. Everything was sort of retracting, pulling back, getting smaller, and we saw this all over the Arctic.
Now, how many students are on this trip with you?
I believe 72.
72?
72 students, and 50 staff members. It's a pretty incredible ratio of students to staff.
That is a phenomenal ratio, and I know you've been at it for a number of days now. Where did the voyage begin for you?
We began in Reykjavik in Iceland, and we spent a few days sort of getting to know Iceland, which you can't, obviously, in a few days. But we visited different parts of Reykjavik. We traveled across Iceland, which has an incredible geological history, and observed different phenomena, volcanoes, geysers, all sorts of things. And then we set sail and headed into Greenland, or started moving towards Greenland. And after about a day, we approached the fjords of southern Greenland and began traveling through there. And then we will now continue to Labrador, north of the Labrador coast, and go into Ungava Bay and end up in Kuujjuaq, Quebec. So from Reykjavik to Kuujjuaq.
What's it like living on the ship with 72 other students and the 50 staff members?
It's a very strange experience because you don't really have any privacy, and when you're seasick, as some people were for 2 days, it can be a bit unpleasant. But that should not obscure the fact that it's an incredible experience to be able to have access to all the staff members and other students and colleagues and peers who have a wealth of knowledge and who come from all over the world. It's like unlike anything I've ever experienced before in that sense.
And maybe that's the next question and the most important one. What so far for you, when you think about this knowledge that's been shared with you, we've talked about the fjord that you entered that had been blocked by a glacier before, but the science that's been presented to you by these scientists, what has really stuck with you so far that you think you couldn't have understood if you had, sort of read a textbook or seen a lecture here at home in Toronto, but what have you seen out there in the Arctic that has really stuck with you that you'd like to tell our listeners about?
Well, the thing that you can't really appreciate unless you actually come and experience it is the scale. The scale in every sense of the word. The scale of the glaciers, the scale of the land, and the scale of the change and the scale of the impact that it's having. So when you look at a photo, say, of a glacier in however, 100 years ago and today, and you see that it's retreated, you can't really experience the scale of that retreat unless you actually are in the fjord or on the boat and can observe how many kilometers or acres of rock is now exposed, how much smaller it's become. So it really is the scale that's so important to understanding the situation.
And have you had a chance to see much wildlife in the Arctic summer as you're voyaging through?
We saw some pretty incredible wildlife. In fact, we had one experience that shocked some of the scientists and marine biologists on board, because on the first day at sea, we observed a blue whale mother and calf, and some people have spent, who want to see blue whales months or weeks searching for them at sea, and the fact that we were able to see one on the very, very first day was pretty phenomenal.
That sounds incredible, and I imagine you were speaking about scale before. I've never had the privilege of seeing a blue whale, but from what I know, that is a creature that can only be appreciated in its size and scale when you actually see it.
Yeah, you need to be there to appreciate those animals, because the sightings are so brief, and you spend hours and hours and hours and hours waiting to see something. Then you see the blowhole, and you see the spout, and you see it sort of arch up the back, and maybe the fluke if you're lucky. But yeah, you can't appreciate it unless you're actually there observing it.
And what have the marine biologists been saying they see, the most immediate changes and the most immediate threats there in the Arctic, given what's going on with climate change, given how climate change is progressing? What do they see as the most immediate threats and biggest changes that have happened in the last couple of years and that they expect to happen in the next, let's say, decade or so in the Arctic?
There are so many issues because climate change is such a complicated phenomenon, and the critical thing is that we don't even know necessarily what issues we're going to be facing 50 or 100 years in the future, because the phenomena are so interrelated that all sorts of other things could appear that we were not able to predict beforehand that could accelerate climate change even faster. I'll give you one very quick example. When solar radiation enters the Earth, a great deal of it, or a large portion of it, is reflected back into outer space by snow, by the surface of the Earth, by all sorts of things that reflect it. And that's critical to maintaining the temperature of the Earth in the appropriate range. As greenhouse gases are trapped in the atmosphere and the Earth becomes warmer, the ice and other things that would have reflected solar radiation back into the outer space begin to disappear, which further accelerates the trend. So it's not just the fact that the solar radiation is being trapped, but that it's melting the very things that would have reflected it back out into outer space. So what the scientists have mentioned to us is that things are accelerating. They're changing faster than the models predicted, and other things that we could not have predicted will happen are happening.
And what sort of other things, what effects, particularly in the Arctic, have caught the scientists off guard, either with the speed of their change or things that the models didn't show happening at all in the recent past?
Well, I gave the example of the reflecting of the reflection of the ice. One other thing that comes to mind is the release of methane and greenhouse gases that are trapped currently, and as ice and glaciers melt, could be released out into the atmosphere, and that would further accelerate the trend. So that's another example. As you can see, I want to learn much more about these things so I can give better explanations of them, and I hope I'll be able to do that by the end.
It certainly, there's a lot to take in, and so what I think you were just saying, just to make sure I've got it right, is that, I guess to call it our past sins, but our old industrial gases, methane gases, other greenhouse gases that we put into the atmosphere, that the atmosphere captured and were frozen into the ice, now are being released as climate change accelerates. Therefore, even if we were to, so to speak, clean up our act and stop releasing as many greenhouse gases as we are, the process may continue simply based on old greenhouse gases that are trapped in the ice that are being melted, and I guess sort of a feedback loop. Is that a fair way to describe what's happening?
I'll clarify a point there. When it comes to carbon dioxide releases, that is industrial activity. But a lot of the other stuff is what was naturally trapped in the Earth. The Earth has a great deal of carbon and other greenhouse gases, but they were controlled or stored in ways that were natural and that did not affect the climate adversely. So if humans catalyze it, then there will be other things. Natural stores of greenhouse gas will be released. So we sort of like getting the ball rolling and then watching it accelerate, and in a way that's hard to control, but possible to control.
Well, I guess that is the important question. I mean, aside from the experience of being in the Arctic, which is amazing, and it's been great that you can share that with us as listeners, if we're concerned about what you're telling us about climate change, what are the things that we should be doing right now?
The important thing, there are two scales of change. There's the personal ones, the ones that we know about that are very clear, practical decisions in terms of purchasing things that are environmentally friendly, not using excess energy. But the other thing that's very, very important and that we cannot go without is also pushing for change on the larger scale, on political scale. And that's something also that's very personally important for me, pushing for change on a larger scale, on a political scale. So the critical thing is to demand to know what politicians and representatives are doing, and to demand that they take action in addition to the things that you also do in your personal life.
And just before I let you go, I know you're downstairs now on the phone with me, but maybe you can just describe what your day was like. What's the weather like? What was the view like before you had to come in and make this phone call that we're so thankful you came in to make?
Sure. Well, we get up early. Generally, we get up at about 6:30. Although today we were lucky, we got to get up at 8. And then after breakfast, I participated in a workshop, which was a mock Arctic Council meeting, and the idea was for students to simulate the work of the Arctic Council. And then in addition to that, we are moving right out into open water now, which is pretty incredible not to be able to see water, or rather not to be able to see land in any direction. And soon we will be able to see Labrador, I think, tomorrow.
Excellent. And I just want to return to your point about making sure we know where our politicians stand and bring it down to the local. For us, I know you're participating with people from around the world, but we've had a recent federal election. We had an election last year at the municipal level, but we do have a provincial election coming up in 2011. And I wonder, what do you think when someone comes and knocks on my door with respect to the provincial election? What sorts of questions should I be asking? And what are the priorities? What sorts of answers would you hope that I'd be hearing from those people knocking on my door?
That's my favorite question. I'll tell you what's extremely important to me, and I think is probably the most important provincial issue for Ontario at the moment, is the Green Energy Act. When candidates come knocking at your door, ask them what their position is on the Green Energy Act. Do they support phasing out coal? Do they support continuing to invest in renewables, as the provincial government seems to have had some interest in doing over the past 4 years? That, in my opinion, is the most important question you've got to ask your candidate. Do they support continuing to invest in renewables and phasing out coal in Ontario by 2014?
Yaneev, it has been such a privilege to have you with us today. Maybe just one final thought for our listeners. What do you hope that you can bring back when you come back from the Arctic that will make a difference? Obviously, we can't all take this trip, but what are you hoping to bring back to Toronto that can make a difference on climate change, having participated in this trip?
Well, what this trip has allowed me to do that I would not be able to do anywhere else is it's put me in contact with peers from all over the world. So now that I know people living in countries across the world, many students from the Arctic also, I'll be in a position to continue to communicate and correspond with them, and that will allow us to work together as on environmental issues as opposed to in isolation.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
And that was Yaneev Forman, who is a local activist here with the Toronto Environmental Alliance. We had an earlier conversation with him a couple of months ago, and today he joined us direct from the Arctic Circle. He's on a voyage there with Students on Ice, learning about the impacts of climate change where they are felt most immediately and most directly, that is in the Arctic and the Antarctic. It was a real pleasure to have a chance to speak to Yaneev again, and I hope you enjoyed hearing about his experiences as much as I did.